So before I begin, I'm just going to take a bit of time to introduce Ian and Mike. So Ian Sargent has an MA in Contemporary Curatorial Practice from the School of Art, Birmingham City University. He's currently Midlands 3 Cities AHRC funded PhD researcher, also at Birmingham City University, and his practice-based research is titled Visual Representations and Cultural Reconstructions of Black British Masculinities in 21st Century Birmingham. And in Ian's capacity as a freelance curator, recent exhibitions have included Reimagining Donald Rodney at Vivid Projects in 2016. And this exhibition explored the digital embodiment and the rich legacy of the late Black British artist Donald Rodney. And forthcoming curated exhibitions include Donald Rodney at the Celine Gallery in Glasgow in 2021 and Cut and Mix Representations of Black British Masculine Identities at New Art Exchange in Nottingham, and that's also in 2021. And so Ian is a member of New Art West Midlands Executive Advisory Group and Film Hub Midlands Advisory Group, and he's also the director of Performing and Visual Arts Organisation Collaboration, and director at Vivid Projects, a non-profit company supporting media arts practice and artist-led exhibition space Alt Gallery. So thank you, Ian, for being with us this evening. And Mike Phillips is a Professor of Interdisciplinary Arts at the University of Plymouth, and he's also the Director of Research at IDAP.org, an open research lab for playful experimentation with creative technology. And his entanglement with Donald Rodney dates back to 1984, where they shared a studio at the Slade School of Art and continued through several of Rodney's work, such as Visceral Canker, Psalms, and Donald Rodney's Autoicon, which is what we're here to talk about tonight. So thanks again, Mike and Ian. And so I think I was just wondering, before we begin, I just wondered, Mike, if I could maybe just start with you. And maybe just given your friendship and your history with Donald Rodney, if you could just maybe just tell us just a little bit about, Autoicon and how that came about, just maybe, a little bit.
Sure. Thanks for inviting me to contribute to this. So it was, I guess I first was introduced to Donald at the Slade School of Art in 1984, I think 84, God, it was a long time ago. And we shared a studio together. It was in Studio 5, which was the kind of mixed media, multimedia bit, and Stuart Brisley ran that. Susan Hiller was there. And it was an interesting kind of time. I kind of joined it kind of weirdly because I was doing a lot of kind of interactive electronic-y kind of art back then, and I'd applied when Tim Head was running it, which was a little bit more interactive, and then I'd gone away to the States for a year and deferred entry, and came back, and Tim had, I think, stepped down and Stuart had taken over, so it had sort of become a very political kind of year, which I was slightly out of filter with maybe in the work that I was doing, but I shared this space with Donald in there, and it was a pretty cool studio. Donald was on the sort of inside bit, and I was there. And we collaborated for a long time, but it was actually the Slade, I think, where you can see the roots of Autoicon, because that's where Jeremy Bentham sits. I think he's on tour of the States right now, but Bentham, the kind of utilitarian philosopher, had himself mummified for the after his death in about 1850, I think, and that sat there. And we used to regularly walk up and down that kind of central corridor looking at Autoicon. And through that kind of collaboration, which was, on my part, was quite kind of technical help with the work that Donald was doing, we discussed that function of Autoicon, because it's it was a political act, slightly humorous act by Bentham. And so when we worked through all of these processes, at the time, towards the end, I remember Donald telling me when we first met that because of his sickle cell, he had a life expectancy of about 36, which, was a shocking thing to hear up against that clock. And around that time, there was this resurgence, or there was this work going on, which was sort of slightly inspired by William Gibson and Neuromancer and all those cyberpunk works, where there was a fascination with the avatar and the human body represented in the kind of cyberspace, digital space. And we were talking about that. It always seemed to be like the efforts people were making to work in that. And there was some, no disrespect to those early efforts to do that, but it was interesting how they were kind of pretty pale. The politics was a little light, and so Donald's body of work, which was literally both his body politic and his body, the physical material he had, seemed to be the perfect kind of thing to at least register in that kind of context. And so we had a couple of conversations about it, and then he died the day we got the Arts Council grant to actually make the thing. And then it was following that we assembled the Donald Rodney PLC and others who'd worked with him through most of his kind of creative life, and worked together to assemble it. And I think that was 2020, wasn't it, when it came out? 2000, something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Took a while. There was a kind of period of what do you do when you've got this idea, you've got this, and it seemed to get more valuable as an idea the longer we left it until we put it together. And originally it was a web work rather than CD-ROM, which you have in the show. It was installed on the Innova website, which Gary was working there at the time and put that together. And so he made a version of it for distribution, which is the CD-ROM, which I have a copy of here, slightly broken copy of. And that's running on your machine in the lab there, in your gallery. And then we had a launch of it at Innova. I actually have the launch sort of vaguely documented on the IDAT website, which had a very peculiar intervention from Mad for Real. There's the two Chinese artists. Quite weird how that happened. It was called the Dirty Space, this lab that we did this sort of launch of Autoicon in, and something got a little lost in translation. They did this performance sort of, in the middle of it, which was a little peculiar, to say the least. Oh, look, there's Aid. It's Aid Ward who actually coded this. I'm so glad you could come.
Oh, brilliant. Yeah, and I think, it's good to kind of hear that background, Mike. I think it's really important to kind of put it in that context, because we're kind of showing it now 20 years later, but there's a kind of a real history to how it began. I think is really important to share. And I think despite that slip of like, it came out in 2020, if you think about how, it's still going, isn't it? It's still something that people can engage with now in the present, which I think is really incredible to think of a work made such a long time ago. And, the impact that it still has, I think is amazing. And so thank you for kind of giving us that background. And just coming to you, Ian, I just wanted to know maybe what your thoughts are on the ways in which Donald Rodney used Autoicon to represent himself in the digital space.
Thanks, Mike. I think Mike kind of answered it well. He probably will answer it more eloquently than me. I think it's the body politic, the physical body. I wrote down made some notes in terms of that question, in terms of what it means, and I'll think of things like autonomy, that notion, that idea of the giving himself autonomy to come into being, and this idea of the foresight, whether we kind of regard it in that notion of mortality, immortality, that foresight then as Mike kind of referenced, that actually my time is limited. So he's kind of always constantly thinking about that notion of mortality, immortality, and that's it kind of sits between those things about how it enabled him to then be realized beyond, like the rest of the body of his work, to kind of be realized in digital space in that regard. I also think of, in terms of, it being able to kind of contribute to this legacy that not only Donald, but other artists, that were kind of regarded within that Black art movement, but also the Black art group, in terms of the legacy that they have, that again are, part of the exhibition, and how that contributes to the legacy around, the British art canon, not, let alone the Black British art canon in that regard. And I think we'll probably come on to this a bit later on, and whether it kind of reflects or responds to this notion of Afrofuturism or futurisms in that regard. And I think we'll come on to that a bit later on, I suppose. Again, something that I was kind of looking back, and because I'd have to say that for me as well, that if it wasn't for Donald Rodney, I probably wouldn't be sat here having this conversation, because it was Donald Rodney's practice and then the wider Black art group that kind of got me into this position, in the sense that through it was kind of recognizing back in 1990. Well, I was going to probably make that mistake. I think it was in 2008 when Innova had the 10th anniversary, of Donald's, to commemorate the launch of Donald's practice, or commemorate his death in 10 years down the line, that they were doing this thing in London. And I was kind of going around going, well, why aren't they doing this in Birmingham, or in the Midlands, even to kind of reflect and remember somebody that was so instrumental and fundamental to what was happening here. So it's because of Donald's practice that I am here, and again, also to people like giving thanks to people like Mike and the Diane Simmons and the rest of people that have kind of been involved, Keith Piper and the likes. But also I kind of think about this idea of in terms of the digital space, and what Claire Bishop kind of asks about, of how many people how many people really confront what it means to think, see, and filter effects of the of the digital. And I think that if you think about where we are in this very moment, doing this conversation online, because of what's happened, globally, that again, I think Donald's thinking was kind of in that idea then of what happens down the line, about what happens to my legacy. And I think we can all kind of sit here and realize that we've had to kind of confront some of those issues ourselves, our own mortality, our own immortality, that this this situation has also created. So I think in that regard, I think I had so much fun kind of sitting there when I went to the gallery the other day and sat and had those conversations again, and typed in on the machine, and just how it kind of conjures up. You can have this conversation, you can hear his voice. It's like, again, I just think that those kind of, the idea of his embodiment sitting in that CD-ROM that Mike held up earlier on, it's amazing. And for me, I remember that hearing his voice for the first time was like, wow. It kind of it was really kind of just opened up so many different possibilities for me in thinking about what his practice meant for me. And I can't speak of him in the sense that Mike can, and I don't intend to. I think that's important to kind of draw that line, that I'm coming to it from a curatorial, from an academic side of research and interest in that regard. So I think just to kind of go back to that, then I think it's important now that we can see the possibilities and what Donald was thinking about, I think, as artists, where we've had to kind of reassemble and realize how we might be able to practice and continue to practice in this moment, and what the possibilities are, because I think that's what Donald did. He latched onto his own mortality and what the possibilities might be in the future. And by creating that with Donald Rodney PLC, this is why we're here now, to kind of start having this conversation about it.
Yeah, I think, yeah, thank you, Ian. I think, you know, you've touched on quite a lot of different points that we can kind of perhaps expand on as we continue the dialogue. But I think, yeah, the idea of legacy is just really, really key, isn't it? That legacy that is left that allows us, like you said, to be here to kind of have this dialogue around that. And I think that's significant to kind of think about. And that you've mentioned about, you know, ideas around foresight, and I guess, you know, we could question kind of, you know, if Donald, you know, would he have imagined this kind of dialogue happening, like you said, in this space that we're having it in? I think I don't think that's something that you could have imagined, but it just seems so fitting in a way that actually we are having this conversation online, you know, people joining in, and it's going to be recorded and people can watch it back later. And, you know, I think there's something about that that gives it a different, an added layer. And, you know, Mike, you know, to kind of throw that question that I gave to Ian to you as well, do you have anything to add around that? You know, your thoughts on the ways in which Donald Rodney used Autoicon to represent himself in the digital space?
Yeah, it's well, it goes. I think it goes beyond the digital space because as well, though, because, you know, you look at the materiality of the work that he made. It was all about, well, not all about, obviously, but the body politic was very much about his physical body. So I worked with him on Bissell Canker, which was actually shown at the Icon. I remember I set that up years ago, but the tapes now have that, and it's that had his blood pumped around it. Plymouth City Council wouldn't allow that to happen, but it did. That was the plan. And the two heraldic arms of John Hawkins and Elizabeth I, who gave John Hawkins the first license to start slavery in England, was was an incredibly powerful piece, and it was about that physical bit of his body and that bloodline running through, and also the House of My Father with the made from this, and I've uncovered this original invite, and this is actually part of. You can see that you probably can't see that very well, but that's the DNA. It's actually on the cover of Autoicon as well. It's the DNA that Donald was working with. So these kind of transitions that went on between, his medical body, the of his body was fundamental to that. And as that moved into a kind of digital legacy for it, because of that bloodline and that physicality, I think these works are interesting because of that absence as well, though. You're right, because you would be laughing his head off right now. That's what you would be doing. And the laugh was so incredible. I mean, there's only maybe Stellark has a laugh which is as imposing and kind of joyous, but I haven't heard many more laughs like that. And that sense of humour with this, I think, was, you can see that commonality between what Bentham was trying to do. This was a massive provocation that was being made there, which was like an affront to so many kind of kind of the establishment, and that's what I think Donald was doing by pulling up and entwining these his body with that historical body. But also, if you look at something like Psalms, which we worked on as well, that's all defined by his absence. Although the wheelchair has this kind of digital algorithmic process embodied in it, it's the fact that he's not there and this thing is working, is carrying out his behavior that he defined. And that's what I think you can see in Autoicon, both in terms of that generative quality of the work, which was that montage that he was used to do from his hospital bed. It has that behavior in it, which was very Donald and really, really challenging. And it was kind of the process of building this. Abe did all the coding for it, but I did all the video bits and those voice recordings that you heard there. I put those together in a hotel room somewhere in Dallas, I think. For some it was on a crappy Mac PowerBook, pushing it, even though they were tiny little clippets there. And that was an incredibly powerful thing to reassemble somebody from memories that, you know, it was a very peculiar thing. And it's still there. It's a different relationship I have with it now, but it's still a very powerful, you know, kind of enactment of a memory of him, which is, I think, was great getting it out for the show, to sort of put it back together again, and the fact that it still works as well is an achievement.
Yeah, I think definitely. I think similarly to Ian, around understanding my relationship with the work as a curator, as, like you said, coming from that academic side of trying to understand it, and then kind of hearing you talk about it and talk about how the work itself, you know, there's a sense of Donald in the work, you know, to kind of get that from you. I think that's really important for people who have already been to the exhibition and engaged with the work, or people that will have an opportunity to do that hopefully when we reopen. I think that's really important to think about that. So you're not kind of, the engagement you're having, there is a sense of Donald, his presence, that is something that when you Mike, you engage with it, you're feeling that as well. So I think that's so it's kind of transcending that limitations that sometimes with screens and chatting and typing in a box. You know, there's maybe a bit more of an intimacy there, that because of the way that you talk about it and how you can see that some of Donald's sense of humor comes through in the work and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, you know, having a conversation with the Autoicon was a bit like having a conversation with Donald in many ways. It was quite often random. It was hysterical outbursts of laughter, and you know, for somebody who was in such kind of pain all the time, it was incredibly joyous, and you know, it shamed everybody else with their tiny little problems. It was quite an impressive series of conversations that you had, and it uses sort of key words which have that kind of Rogerian psychotherapist bit, which was part of it, the ELIZA, original 60-odd ELIZA AI, which just plays back to you things, but then with this kind of weird randomness in it as well. So although you do start a conversation, it then throws out these kind of weird tangential inputs, which I think actually art, you know, in one sense, it's that kind of ambiguity and that randomness, which evokes something of Donald's behavior, which of course you can't ever possibly do, but it does have something in there which is I still, you know, it's pretty cool. But I mean, it's also important, I think, to think about Donald's work in the digital context of, but it's also, now that you look back on that, you can also see that that work that was dealing with the kind of material of his body, the matter of his body, actually the whole bioart movement, he was so far ahead of that. And this playing around with AI and code, his DNA as code, all of these things, and the imaging technologies he was using, with whether it was X-rays or kind of you know, those fantastic hair pieces, microscopic stuff. That's really extremely just pushing boundaries in terms of, you know, arts, visual arts practice, which kind of gets almost forgotten about. It leaps ahead, so provocative and so kind of innovative.
Yeah, I think kind of hearing you kind of talk about the background and the technical elements of it and how it all came together, I think is really important, I think, for us to hear, because I think, again, if you're sort of sitting down and just, you know, typing into the chat box, you might not necessarily be thinking about the complexities that went on behind the scenes for you to have what you have in front of you, which, you know, and I think those added elements around, you know, bio art and code and, you know, AI, and I think all those elements are just really really interesting to kind of think about, and the way he was thinking about it then and how we are dealing with it now in the present, and these dialogues and these themes and these ideas are still ongoing and continue to be discussed and continue to be extremely relevant in our contemporary lives. And I think that leads me on to the second kind of question that I wanted to.
Can I just,
do you want
just
to
say something?
Go for
Yeah,
it.
because no, I think what you just said there, Mike, is really important, because through everything that you've kind of described in terms of like bio art and like AI and working in all these kind of different kind of mediums and different kinds of realizations, not once it gives us a sense that it isn't. His position was never fixed. It was never singular. And this is what looks at in that regard, and this is why I'm kind of trying to explode within the research, that it wasn't a singular being or singular identity that we're kind of dealing with here, because of how in the different lanes that Donald chose to kind of navigate. And I think that's really important, that we kind of realize that it wasn't fixed, that it was very fluid, that it was hybrid, and he was kind of prepared to kind of challenge himself and challenge his own understandings and appreciation of the world around him, and also his own medical condition. That when we kind of distilled it down to its rootedness in terms of how it affected predominantly African, Caribbean and South Asian people, we could talk about it in that regard. But I think what you just said there is really important, that we don't just solely locate it in the confines of, say, Black arts practice, that it was more about this wider idea of understanding and appreciation of himself, but also the world around him, this social world, this cultural world, the technological world, and that kind of thing as well. So yeah, I think that was really important of you to say that.
Thanks, Ian. I think you're right. I think we as we unpack the work, I think you're right. We don't want it to. And I think this talk we're having is allowing people to kind of see it from that context. So it's not, like you said, just a limited and narrow way that in which you might want to choose to look at Donald Rodney's practice, but actually here we start to pull it apart and look at some of the other thinking that went on behind it, and how it was pulled together, and how it embodied so much more than the politics that people sometimes want to pigeonhole the work into, and actually look at it in terms of, like you said, thinking about technology then in the late 90s, and how those technologies have developed to now, and how now the work is still as relevant as it was then, which I think is really important to articulate in there. And then if we're thinking about now, we're thinking about the contemporary experiences that we're in now. How can Donald Rodney's work speak to the contemporary experiences of navigating digital spaces? Mike, I can put that question to you first and see how you might want to elaborate on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because we're looking at a CD-ROM version of it. That the original was online, running on the server, which meant that it was kind of distributed in a different way. It wasn't the kind of the CD-ROM back then was the future of new media, but the web was kind of less well navigated, but actually allowed greater access, and also the manifestation of the autoicon in multiple places at the same time was also good. So it was this distributed body which was really quite important to it, and I think that's really interesting in terms of at that time at the Slade there was some, or sort of before that, where you can see some of these kind of where Donald's work was really being picked up by there was the Sandy Nairn show, which the Black Art Group was picked up in, is it State of the Nation or something like that?
Yeah.
And then Donald had a show at the ICA, I think, during that time. He was having exhibitions, and it was really he was getting known for that work. There was a kind of backstory going on with some work we were doing with Robert Pepper and Roy Ascott, which was the sort of network art things. And there was the guy who ran the slate was Professor George, who was a terribly nice old chap, and we actually got for an RS-232 connection to plug a Mac Plus in so we could do this network stuff. Donald wasn't really, he was like watching that stuff. I think he was fundamentally interested in it, but he wasn't really playing with it. And, you know, we had this conversation with Professor George just to have this thing fitted, which every phone has now. And Professor George said, why on earth do you want this? Why don't you just meet people and have a cup of coffee with them? Which, of course, nowadays would be fantastic to do. But it seemed like a real denial of a potential of this kind of immaterial thing. And that's what Donald was really also interested in, this kind of immateriality, even though it was rooted in, you know, this kind of bodily material, its representation through these different technologies. In that, I remember that in Professor George's studio, which was called S Studio or something like that, or which was a still life studio. There was they had this little bowl of fruit that was sat there, which every day they'd go in and paint, you know. And Donald went in there one day and ate the apple and was really evicted. And it was a kind of part, you know, it was a funny thing to do, but actually it was a challenge to, you know, the Slade was back then a very, well, it wasn't, it was always a little bit radical around that period as opposed to the RCA and stuff, but there was this rooted in this kind of value of the objet d'art, which I think Donald was fundamentally challenging with this stuff. And all of these technologies are about dismantling something in the way that they've been assembled and distributed. So, yeah, I think in terms of, you know, trying to answer your question, that there's, yeah, it offers something now to us, because I don't actually think that any of the avatar work that's going on right now, you know, which has been reduced to kind of Pokemon and, you know, whatever avatar you have represented in Facebook, or, you know, they're all just you know, they're infinitely inferior to how provocative this work is still, and especially when it was a network piece, because the idea of representation within it is so complex. You know, just having an image of yourself, which was always part of the problem with all of that avatar work that was done in the 90s, you know, which was about representing yourself as a picture, as an image, whereas this is a dynamic kind of thing, which actually the imagery within it is slightly obscured. It's almost intangible, and yet there is this character, I think, emerges through it, through those behaviors and your interaction with it. So, I mean, I still feel that this is an incredibly provocative and challenging thing. You know, today with all the advancements in technology and more sophisticated conversational AIs that you can have, this still has in it something really quite powerful. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Mike. Ian, do you want to?
I kind of, you know, I think that what's interesting about, you know, if we think about digital space, I kind of think of it's like any other space, I suppose, in the sense that, you know, we're talking about a sphere, whether it be a private or public space, a cultural space, a social space, and those kind of things. And you think of, you know, it's interesting, you know, what Mike was saying about this idea of the avatar and how back then what was happening then was about, you know, much more provocative. I was thinking then, that does it allow people to kind of hide behind and, you know, disguise themselves behind, you know, particular kinds of avatars nowadays and that kind of thing as well. It's like a defense mechanism almost sometimes, a shielding mechanism sometimes as well. And I also started to kind of think about, you know, if we think of the digital space, and we, even though I'm no longer on social media, I think of, you know, the phenomena of Black Twitter and what that means for a lot of people in terms of the empowerment that it provides, as well as the digital noise that it can create. But there is a sense of, you know, of solidarity that happens within that space. and and the reaction and the originality that exists within that space as well. I think of that. But then also, I think there's so there's on one side there's the liberating aspect that that it can have, but there's a sense of peril that exists within the digital space. We can go through the many kind of variations of that, and something that I kind of recently kind of been discussing was I'm going to try and make sure that I pronounce the name correctly now. Joy Bulawimni's Aspire Mirror, where she's like this MIT research fellow, and she kind of created this mirror that would then like a mirror on the wall that would kind of generate these kind of thoughts of your kind of your desires and your thoughts going forward. So you'd kind of look in this mirror, and then it would kind of project either text or images of empowerment, of empathy, of into the future, looking into the future. However, the problem with the mirror and the technology was that it didn't recognize her darker hue and her facial features. And this is the problem within AI, in the sense that she was not able to and the way in which she was able then to have her face seen was by donning a white mask. So it then goes back to this idea then that this technology that we're all using still has the hands of of white men and white people, kind of, or that Eurocentric idea of what is normal in terms of the visual representation. You also can think back to, say, Kodak photography, and the fact then that back in the day darker skins weren't showed up properly in photography, and the only reason why Kodak kind of expanded their range in terms of the film speeds and that was in response to furniture makers that were taking photographs of wood products with the darker kind of textures, and so they wanted to make sure that they were properly catching the detail. It wasn't because of black folks in that regard. It was because of, oh, we're going to respond to the market. So kind of going back to this idea then that the digital space can be an inspiring space, and it can be, but it also can be a very perilous space, and it also can be a space where people don't have access to that facility to kind of enable and speak freely on that in that space, or even have access to the technology. So whilst we're able to have this kind of conversation right now, there is a lot of inequality that still exists within that. So I think we should, whilst we're kind of celebrating what it can do and what it's enabled us to do, especially in this moment, again, I kind of keep going back to this current moment, we can also think of the people that aren't able to kind of participate and are being excluded. And the more in which we kind of continue down this route, then we have to look at what the economics are within that as well. So yeah, that's what I would kind of. I don't know if I've kind of answered the question. I've kind of gone off on this bit of a rant. So sorry. Pull me back in. Rake me back in.
I think you have, though, Ian. I think if we're asking about how it speaks to contemporary experiences of navigating the digital space, I mean, you're talking about contemporary experiences. I mean, all the kind of examples that you've given kind of sit within that wider dialogue. And I think it's tying into this question and the next question, which I was going to ask, which is about, can we read Autoicon as a digital site of resistance? And I was thinking about that in relation to things like Black Twitter, and going back the Arab Spring and things like that, and the way in which the digital space, what it's done in terms of visibility of people of color and their lived experiences. And but I think simultaneously you're also looking at the other side of the coin, in terms of the positive and the negative. And I guess, my question around how it kind of, we draw that back to Autoicon is like, you know, can we read Autoicon as a digital site for resistance with that background? And I guess if you maybe want to expand on that a little bit more, you can do, because you kind of had started that dialogue already.
Yeah, I think, you know, kind of, you know, there is, I kind of, again, I kind of made a note in the sense that, you know, this idea of you know, just to kind of finish off that last bit, was this idea of going through this, you know, this what Du Bois was kind of talking about in terms of double consciousness, and that two-ness of always seeing oneself through the eyes of others, and, like, you know, being measuring ourselves through by others, and that what Bulwini kind of calls the coded gaze, you know. So there is that sense of who's kind of, you know, in charge of this technology, and who's kind of leading it. And I think, you know, some of the works that you've got in the gallery space that looks at, you know, Afrofuturisms, and, you know, that feminist Black feminist movements that are kind of taking charge of, you know, those designs, and taking charge of the ideas within that. I think that's really important. I think that's, you know, again, it kind of explodes and explores that the idea beyond the kind of hegemony that exists within, you know, coding and technology design and development. I think we need to kind of start to look beyond that and see and understand where that exists, as you said, in terms of resistance, but also in terms of how that resistance then is handed down and helps to liberate others, because that's what resistance is about. Is also about liberating others into kind of thinking that they too can participate, and they too have something to say, and, you know, can contribute to that conversation. So yeah, I think in many ways that that Autoicon is a site of resistance, because of its, you know, if you think of Afrofuturism, it is about, you know, resisting beyond the narrow margins that denies us the idea of existing within history, you know, in terms of how you think of the invisibility, but then also the hypervisibility of Blackness within the sense of history. But also then, if you think of the challenge to, if we think of history as being written from the Eurocentric hand, then we also, the Eurocentric masculine hand at that as well, we have to then see ourselves as being able to kind of write ourselves into a history within that regard. So I think that's what's important there, that we have to challenge these things and resist those things, but also then to kind of liberate and, you know, push ourselves forward. I think that's what's important about why Autoicon is so important now, as it, you know, as it was then, you know. And, you know, again, it goes back to, you know, people like Mike and the Donald Rodney PLC and others that made it, you know, made it come into being. So yeah, I think it's so important. And the last thing that I would say, you know, and we were kind of talking about this the other day, was where you've kind of situated it within the gallery, that is at the threshold into the room of Afrofuturism, and it sits between the idea of Afrofuturism. So it's all in that liminal space. It's in that space between the past and the present, and, you know, into the future. So, you know, we were kind of talking about that, and it's really important how, when you navigate in the space, that you see where it is located, and it is between the past and the present and into the future, and, you know, physically in the gallery space. So I think you kind of contextualized it really well within, you know, curatorially within its space as well. So yeah, that's what
thanks, Ian. I think I'm just thinking of what we've discussed a little bit in terms of the future and the foresight that Donald Rodney had, and that actually maybe that can begin to sit with this idea of imagining oneself in the future. And actually, Sonia Dyer's work, which is in the exhibition, and she's interviewed Black female scientists, and one of the scientists she's talking to comments that Martin Luther King saw the importance of speculative fiction because there was an opportunity for Black people to imagine themselves in the future.
Yeah.
And so I think, where Autoicon sits is in that kind of middle space, because it is, in some ways, people talk about it as an archive, an archive of Donald Rodney, and his voice has been archived, and but then in some ways you can see it. I would read it as like, he was imagining himself into the future, because here we are, 2020, and his voice is still, can be heard both in the way in which the work has been created, but actually you can actually hear his voice still now, and he's part of this, the now, and can continue to be. And I think that in terms of being a digital site for resistance is really important, because then if you come back to this idea of Black Twitter, in that it's giving people a voice now, which can be archived and then be looked at as a legacy. I think, there's something about Autoicon, I think, that allows it to sit within that space. Yeah, just, to bring you in, Mike, just it'd be good to hear your thoughts as well around this question, and then after that we'll move on to see if there's any questions from the audience.
Yeah, there's representation in art been defined by dead white males for way too long, and there's a sense of Autoicon coming out of this, coming from this historical perspective of the group of people who were remembering Donald and kind of building on the kind of DNA that he put into the thing to kickstart it. It's interesting in terms of, and I thought that Guardian review was great actually, in terms of that imagining a future, because it does define something. And again, I think it's interesting because even though Donald's work was very visceral in the way that it represented things, the imagery, the construction of these works was very tangible, physical, and often kind of fairly violent in what it was showing you. There's a sense that the Autoicon here isn't about that legacy carried forward from representation of the body, or it is something that he defined as this thing that's shifting all the time. And I think that's where that potential for the future embodiment, which is, you can almost break away from that kind of heritage and to define something new. And I've been following the work of Fugazi, that the festival in South Africa. One ex-PhD student of Plymouth Collegian, Tegan Bristow, works at Wits University, and it is an incredible redefining of a kind of representation beyond the kind of graphic representation, and you can see that in the work of the Black Art Group. Although there's a lot of it came out of art college, it came out of an engagement with the art market and things like that. It does have within it this future self there, which is cool.
Totally. Again, it's if you think of like Eddie Chambers' destruction of the National Front, and you kind of look at it in terms of those 4 separate images, you can think of the decades that have kind of since the 1980s to where we are, that these flags represent each decade, and brings us to this moment, where it's kind of reimagined in its kind of really kind of scary symbolic sense. And you think of how the notion of Britain has been deconstructed and reconstructed in that time, when at the beginning of the neoliberal project under Margaret Thatcher, and what that meant for many of us in the so-called inner cities and in the cities across the nation, but also at the same time because at that same time it did propel in the Big Bang and all those kind of things. It was what generated to where we are now, and that was more to, again, it was kind of tied into the economic imperative. It wasn't about okay, let's do this thing in the sense that we will, be liberating people. It was about, let's liberate the stock market so that we can make loads and loads of money. And that's, you have to kind of always look at it within those kind of contexts, and that's why this thing remains really important, that it is a site for resistance. It is about, projecting on to a future that is about, because there's a sense, I think there's this research that looks at Afro-pessimism, and the sense that we're always kind of kind of tied to this to the history that we've been erased, or from the histories that have been so embodied by violence and suffering. There is a sense of that. So there is a sense of Afro-pessimism. I think that's a term. I haven't really looked fully into that, but in terms of my own experiences of around my research, in terms of my practice, I think that what's interesting now and what's vital that comes out of Donald's practice and Autoicon and the rest of it is that it speaks from a position of that in the 80s it wasn't about pessimism, because despite all the ish that was going on, it was looking at, let's document this, but also at the same time, let's look beyond this. Let's give people something to look beyond, so that we can start to question our sense of self here and now, because that's what gives us our sense of purpose. If we start to question who we are as individuals in terms of our identities, as women, as men, as as gay, as queer, straight, what have you, we begin to kind of question that, and within that, then it gives us a purpose for looking, into the future and projecting ourselves into the future, I suppose. So that's what's important about this work. That continues to be important about this work as well.
Fantastic. I think we'll probably might stop just at that point, Ian. I think we could continue, and I think there's so much more that could be said and talked about in relation to this work. But I just wanted to just open it up to the audience if anybody had any questions, specific questions that they wanted to ask while we've been talking. Maybe there's a question that you had in mind. Do write it into the chat. I think I did see one question had come up, which I will just bring up. Okay, so somebody was asking about the CD-ROM that you had up, Mike, if that's still accessible. Like, can people get a copy of that? Or
the actual, I don't think there's many. I guess we could always do some reprints, but I think I put it up as a downloadable thing somewhere. I sort of scraped it off, and you can download it. It on a Mac you need System 9. Aid, who was here earlier, I'm sure can reprogram it. It does work on a Windows, and I think we can just make a kind of image of it. I thought I'd done it. Maybe it's on a different site here. Yeah, it could be shareable. It should be shareable. Can you rewrite it, Aid, too?
Okay. Well, so yeah, the same person. Oh, sorry, Aid, feel free to jump in and comment.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the CD producing that and working on the code for it was a very a personal experience, I think, and really challenging. I think from my point of view, I was already very comfortable with the idea of code being an extension of a person, but from my point of view, it was always myself. So then to go in and do it for somebody else, for Donald, and to work with that massive archive was a real interesting challenge. I think these days, obviously, a lot of time has passed. I'm more interested in how we preserve things like this, like not necessarily about the CD-ROM, and obviously there's technicalities about getting that to work, and it's difficult, and it must have been a challenge getting it to work for the exhibition. But how important is it for us to preserve these digital works for future generations, or let them decay in the same way that we let bodies decay or memories decay over generations? And obviously, that's a difficult, difficult question.
No, I think it's an interesting question, because I was thinking about that said same thing, and it's really nice to meet you, Adrian. Yeah, because because it exists on the CD-ROM and no longer online, where online it would continue to be, but in its state it's kind of almost locked in a particular moment. And I think that's important, because do we go in and retouch the Mona Lisa, or do we yeah, it's those kind of questions. And I think, yeah, I think, Mike, when you were talking about visceral canker, was whether that should be, that piece of work should be repaired, or say Psalms, does that need a new so it's what happens to these artifacts, these digital artifacts, in that regard, I think.
I mean, it is interesting, because the collection of these works, the Tate visceral canker, and the kind of been discussions about Psalms, and visceral canker has this problem that you can conserve all the gold leaf on the heraldic arms, but all the components, the electronic components, were from the RS catalogue, which have actually started to perish now after 20 odd years, and and they also don't exist in their kind of analog form, so you can an equivalent, but it's digital, and it's in a box, and so you can't see it. And part of it was that's got sort of perspex on that, so you can see the inner workings of it. So the discussion is, how do you rebuild the electronics, or do you get the equivalent piece? And it's an issue for the Tate to deal with that, and also that's really interesting, because that is an algorithm running there. So in a bit of code, which is in a very old laptop, which is running in a very old chair, and you can see the physicality of the chair, because it's an artwork, it's a sculpture, it's a kind of just being taken and augmented in this way. But actually, is that, in terms of the code and the electronics, the digital bit, is it just the algorithm that's the bit that needs to be preserved? And that's a much bigger discussion, I think, as you say, Aid, with Autoicon, because it's almost like you could almost reinterpret the behavior of it in a completely different piece of software to mimic the kind of ambiguity and faultiness of this, which yeah, so that is an interesting discussion. But I mean, but in terms of answering the question, in terms of could somebody get hold of this, I'm sure we could redistribute it. I think the original run, I think we ran it under an open source license or something back then. We used to. But yeah, I'm sure we can.
Yeah, I think the person that asked the question has said, yeah, please, could you make it downloadable? So I think, yeah, but so I think, yeah, I think we're probably gonna finish the conversation here. I think our time is up, but I just really want to say a big thank you to Ian and Mike for being here to talk and just share your thoughts around Autoicon, and Adrian as well, coming in there to answer that question for us, and just to everyone who's joined in today. It's been a really yeah, there's a lot we've talked about. We could continue, but thank you so much, everyone, for being part of this event this evening. And as I said earlier, it's been recorded and it will be made available for everyone to watch back. And I know a few people that weren't able to be part of the event but wanted to watch it, so that will be available for people to have a look, to watch back. So thank you. Yeah, lots of people saying thank you in the chat. So yeah, brilliant. Thanks for your time.